It's time to change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh.
But here David, who is now over 60 years old, he's once again fleeing for his life, something he hasn't had to do for a long time since the days of Saul. And again, David here, he's lost everything he has, everything that he's built up until now. And he's leaving with only the clothes on his back. And this time, he doesn't have the strength of a young man. But the one thing he does have is he has friends, and he knows who they are. And then we're introduced to David's friend Ittai the Gittite, who was a Philistine from Gath. And David questions him, and he asks him why he's going. Because he's only been in Jerusalem for a day. So he doesn't owe David any loyalty. And David knows that he's in exile. So he has just gone through the same kind of time, getting kicked out of his own country, like they're doing now. So he had already fled for his life. And so David, what he does is he excuses him from going, because David knows that he will be safe in the city of Jerusalem, that he doesn't need to go through all these hardships with David. And so David tells Ittai to return and to remain with the king. And you got to see here, God has never called Absalom the king, but David here, he calls Absalom the king twice. But Ittai, he has already sworn his loyalty to his king. And it didn't matter to him if his king was in the palace or if his king was being chased in the wilderness, but that David is his king. And then he says something very profound here, which sounds a lot like Ruth the Moabite, where he says that he will be with David in life or in death. And where he is, he will be with him. And that's how our commitment should be to our King Jesus, to be able to serve him in life or in death, where we are committed to the person of Jesus Christ as our King, and to serve him wherever he is leading us to go. And so King David tells Ittai to go and to cross with him, and he's talking about them all crossing over the brook Kidron. And the Kidron Valley is on Jerusalem's eastern edge, and that's what separates the city from the Mount of Olives. And this is the very first mention of the brook Kidron in the Bible. And the word Kidron means black, because this brook would become black from all the blood that came from all the lambs offered as sacrifices. And so it would especially become black around the time of Passover. And this brook Kidron that they're crossing, this is the same brook that Jesus crossed the night he was betrayed. And Jesus, he climbs this very same mountain that David climbs, the Mount of Olives. And he would have taken the same path that Jesus would have taken to the Garden of Gethsemane. Where David here, he's suffering for his own sins. But where Jesus, he suffered for ours. And then the two main priests from the tabernacle, Zadok and Abiathar, they bring the ark of God to David, and they come with a number of Levites with them, because if you remember, it's the Levites that have to carry the ark. But David tells them to return to Jerusalem with the ark, because they would be more valuable to David in the city, to be his eyes, his secret spies, because they would be able to maintain their duties at the tabernacle without being noticed. And then with Zadok being a prophet, because that's what a seer is, and it calls him a seer there. A seer is a prophet, that he would be able to give David insight from not only what he sees, but he'd be able to do it from God's viewpoint of what he sees. And so they're valuable to David as spies. And so they quickly set up this communication network where they will use their sons to bring these messages to David. And so what you see here is that God, he is providing everything David will need to get through this trial. And he's doing it as he needs it. And you have to remember, all of this is happening in just one night. And so David, he says he doesn't need the ark because he doesn't see the ark as a good luck charm. He doesn't need it because if God is pleased with David, for David to be his king, David knows that he will bring him back to his ark. But if David is rejected as king, David is prepared to accept that as God's will. So now barefoot and with his head covered, which are signs of great mourning, David is crying as he climbs the mountain. I don't believe he's crying for himself. I believe he's crying for the nation. I believe he's crying for his son. And then he hears that Ahithophel is one of the conspirators. And so David says this really short prayer. And he says, "O Lord, I pray, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness." And then they reach the top of the Mount of Olives, and it says that David, he worships. So what we see here is we see that David, he prayed, and then he worshiped, and then immediately after he worshiped, God answers David's prayer. Because that's when Hushai, the Archite, shows up with his torn robe, because he's been climbing and he's been mourning too. And being an Archite means he's from Arca, which is in Syria, 200 miles north of Damascus. So here it is, another Gentile who's loyal to David, who is also another old friend of his and a counselor in the same way as Ahithophel was a counselor. So he is also wise. But his counsel was never called being the same as the counsel of God. But he is the answer to David's prayer, where Hushai, he might be able to defeat Ahithophel's counsel for David. So David sends Hushai back to Jerusalem as another spy. So Hushai, he's going to be a double agent, and he's going to offer himself to Absalom as a counselor. And then just getting over the top ridge of Mount of Olives, so now David, he won't be able to be seen by Absalom. Then all of a sudden, Ziba's there with donkeys, with food. So God keeps providing to sustain David through this trial. And David's a little suspicious of Ziba's motives. And he asks Ziba, "What do you mean to do with these?" Because he's not sure about Ziba. Ziba is an opportunist. And Ziba tells King David it's for the people he's with. And then David asks, he says, "Where's your master son?" So he's talking about Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, who was the son of King Saul. Because Ziba was King Saul's servant that was given to Mephibosheth. And Ziba lies to David. But David doesn't figure it out that he lied here, but it's going to become very evident later. But Ziba, he paints this picture that Mephibosheth really doesn't support King David, that Mephibosheth is waiting in Jerusalem, waiting to come to power himself, to be restored to King Saul's dynasty, that he's thinking that as soon as David and Absalom, they destroy each other, that he will become king. And no matter how far-fetched that sounds, Mephibosheth isn't there. And the way that this day is going, I don't think David would be surprised being betrayed by another person he cared for. So David, he believes Ziba for now, and he assumes that Ziba is telling the truth. And so he gives Ziba the property that formerly belonged to Saul that had been given to Mephibosheth. Because Ziba, he's that kind of guy who cannot let a good crisis go by without taking advantage of another person's misfortune to profit himself. And then when you would think things couldn't get any worse, but it's always at our lowest point where the devil, he comes out at full force to attack us. And so just as this day couldn't get any worse, then David gets to Bahurim, which is a village in the tribe of Benjamin's territory, where there's someone walking along the ridge, throwing down dirt and rocks, and then he just keeps cursing David with this cowardly attack. And his words never stop, where he's blaming David for everything that ever happened to King Saul, calling him a bloodthirsty man and that he's getting what he deserves. And then Abishai, he gets tired of all the stone and the dirt, and he's ready to kill Shimei, who's a distant relative of King Saul. And David isn't a bloodthirsty man. He never did anything to harm King Saul. And if David was a bloodthirsty man, he would have let Abishai go kill Shimei. But David, he takes the abuse and he's thinking that this may be from the Lord, so that the Lord is allowing it. And he says that it's nothing compared to his son trying to take his life. So he tells Abishai to leave him alone, to let him curse, because David here, he's refusing to take his own vengeance, which is exactly what everybody else in the story is trying to do. They're all trying to take out their own vengeance out on David. But here, David, he refuses to do that because he leaves his vengeance up to God. And so now in verse 15 of chapter 16, it starts with meanwhile. So meanwhile, back in Jerusalem, Absalom and his army, along with Ahithophel, they all show up. And Hushai, David's double agent, he just arrives, just as Absalom arrives. And he greets Absalom. He says, "Long live the king, long live the king." And so Absalom, he questions Hushai's disloyalty to David because Absalom, he understands Ahithophel's disloyalty, but he doesn't understand Hushai's. And so he asks him, why didn't you go with your friend? And Hushai, he lies to Absalom, and he says that he'll serve whoever the people choose as their king. I served your father. Well, why shouldn't I serve his son too? So Hushai, he's trying to make this sound as if this is an act of succession and that it's not a treason. And Hushai's answer, it actually satisfies Absalom. And so now, with Jerusalem under Absalom's control, where Absalom, who wanted to take the kingdom, to be the king, well, now he has it, and he doesn't know what to do with it. And this kind of reminds us of our country, where we have all these people who are seeking power, wanting to take control of the government, removing all the people who are governing. And when they get the power and when they're elected, they don't know what to do with it. They don't know how to govern. They don't know how to rule. Where all they were good at was to make people discontent with the current administration, where all they know is how to destroy what other people have built. And that's how Absalom is here. He's never ruled anything. He's never fought one battle. He's never once led an army into battle. He's just a poster boy. He has his long flowing black hair, and he can ride in a chariot looking like a dark-haired Fabio. But Absalom doesn't know what to do now that he's conquered Jerusalem. And so he asks Ahithophel, because probably this whole plan has been Ahithophel's plan. And so the first thing Ahithophel tells Absalom to do is to go into King David's concubines, to have relations with the 10 wives that David left to keep the palace going. Where though David was told that it would happen one day in a prophecy, David never imagined that Absalom would be able to do this to them. And it was customary for a new king to inherit the previous king's harem, but that's usually after the king's dead. And so what Absalom is doing here is he's declaring himself to be the new king, but not only as the new king, but by him committing these acts of rape, what he's doing is he's making a rift between him and his father, David, that will never be able to be repaired because this is too abhorrent. There could never be any reconciliation after this. And the purpose behind this act is to strengthen those who are supporting Absalom, because in the back of the supporters' minds, they may be thinking that through negotiations that David's son, he might be able to come to some kind of terms of peace with his father, some type of reconciliation where David would turn over the throne to him, maybe at a certain point, and make Absalom the king. Where all these people who are supporting Absalom, then they would be tried for treason against David. So by this act, Absalom is burning all his bridges with no turning back. So Absalom now, he's all in. But Ahithophel's motives in this act, they're different than Absalom's, because all Ahithophel wants to do is to cause David as much pain as he can. He wants to humiliate David in the same way that he was humiliated. And there is no better way to humiliate a man than by raping his wife. And you have to remember here, Ahithophel was once a God-fearing man. He was once considered to be one of the godliest men in all of Israel who enjoyed his fellowship with David. But now, because of his unwillingness to forgive David, where he's allowed this bitterness to grow for these last 10 years, and now having only this one desire, this desire to get even, to pay David back for the hurt David had caused his family because of what he did to Bathsheba and to her husband Uriah. And that this danger of unforgiveness, where it leads to bitterness, and then letting it grow to become obsessed with seeking one's own vengeance above all things, that's a danger for all of us. We need to leave vengeance in God's hand. And it's exactly how God commanded it in Deuteronomy 32:35, where he says, vengeance is mine. In Romans 12:19, it goes on and it quotes that verse, but it also adds, I will repay. And the reason that vengeance belongs to God is because we will take it too far. Because the first thing that unforgiveness does is it blinds us, where we only start to care about ourselves. And vengeance is never as sweet as it promises, and it can never be justified. Because here, what you need to see is the thing that Ahithophel condemned, that act that David had committed against Bathsheba, Ahithophel has now arranged to have that same act committed against 10 innocent women. And all of these women, they all have grandfathers like Ahithophel, besides having grandmothers and families. So instead of Ahithophel taking the high moral ground as if he's better than David, he becomes 10 times more the villain than David ever was. That's because vengeance, it always goes too far. That's why we need to leave vengeance in God's hands. And so now a tent is erected on the roof of the palace. And this is the same roof where David saw Bathsheba bathing. And then one at a time, Absalom leads each of his stepmothers, his father's wives, into the tent and rapes them. And he does this in broad daylight in front of all Israel. So everyone will know that there could never be any reconciliation between father and son. And here, this same Absalom, who committed murder for the rape of his sister Tamar and for the incest that was committed against her, who has justified all of his actions for his murder, for the crimes committed against her, he doesn't take the moral high ground either. He's not showing that he's a better man than his brother Amnon, because Absalom, with his lust for power, he becomes 10 times the rapist Ammon ever was. And he also becomes 10 times the adulterer than his father David ever was. So these people who have been condemning David for his actions, they are no better than him. And Absalom, after committing adultery with David's wives, he too is determined on murdering their husband, which happens to be David. But Absalom, in his pride, he doesn't see it. He feels justified doing this because he's blind to his sin. And even though all this has been prophesied and it's all been told to David by Nathan the prophet, nobody saw this coming except for God. Where God, he didn't cause it, he just foretold it, and he didn't prevent it. And David knew that none of this was God's fault. He knew that all of this was his fault because he was told that the sword would never depart from his house. He was told where these troubles would actually come from. But the good thing is that David, he also knew that he was forgiven from his sin. that God loved him, that God still had a plan for his life, and it was a plan for good. So last week, we saw how Absalom used his newfound freedom after he was pardoned and restored to his official relationship with his father, King David, and how he used that freedom under the guise of religion to form a conspiracy against his father and to take his father's throne for himself. Where Absalom has spent 4 years stealing the hearts of the people while aligning himself with a few powerful men like Ahithophel, who also hated David. And then through his deceptions, Absalom had himself declared king in Hebron, and he sent that message throughout Israel. And then Absalom, as his first act as a self-proclaimed king, he overtakes Jerusalem, which is Israel's capital, entering the city along with his war team of co-conspirators and his army, where he finds that his father, King David, has fled into exile. And he did this because this was the way he would save the people of Jerusalem from bloodshed and becoming the battleground for that civil war that was to be inevitable. And now leaving with not much more than the clothes on their backs, David's household and an army of about 600 men with Cherethites and Pelethites, which are all these Gentile forces, they traveled all night, crossing the brook Kidron and climbing the Mount of Olives until they passed Bahurim, which is in the territory of Benjamin. And that's where David is now waiting for a message to come from the priests, Zodach and Abiathar, who David sent back to be his spies in the city of Jerusalem. Where along with those priests, David, he had also sent back with them his friend and counselor, Hushai, to act as a double agent, to pretend to serve Absalom so that Hushai might be able to defeat the counsel of Ahithophel, whose counsel was like the counsel of God himself. Or even though Ahithophel's counsel was as wise as God's, Ahithophel, he doesn't serve God any longer. Because Ahithophel, he's been eaten up by his unforgiveness for David. And so now bitterness has overtaken his heart, where his only desire now is vengeance. His desire is to cause King David as much pain as he can, and then to kill him, for what King David did to his granddaughter Bathsheba. And so all that's been accomplished so far after Absalom's first day after taking the royal authority and ruling from Jerusalem is the rape of David's 10 wives by Absalom himself under the advice of Ahithophel. So now we begin chapter 17, and we get to hear Ahithophel give his second piece of advice, where Ahithophel, he knows exactly what to do, which is the very thing that David is afraid of. Because for Absalom to be able to keep his authority, he has to stop his father David from taking back the kingdom. So the solution here is simple. Absalom, he has to kill his father. And so Absalom, he's starting to seek a strategy from his war council. And so he has Ahithophel go first. And Ahithophel, he wanted to attack David while he was still on the west side of the Jordan River. And Ahithophel's plan was smart. And if Absalom followed Ahithophel's plan, David would have been slain, and Israel would have been spared this long civil war that would be drug out.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,